Kurt Volker is a former U.S. ambassador to NATO and the executive director at the McCain Institute at Arizona State University. He's joining us now from Philadelphia. A pleasure to have you on the program, Ambassador. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So how do you view, first of all, this Tillerson trip to Moscow? Was progress made, or is it status quo?
I think it was teed up exceptionally well in the sense that we had certain areas of pushback or firmness in dealing with Russia, whether it was the airstrikes in Syria or prior announcements that we're not lifting sanctions that were placed over Ukraine. And then to have a discussion that says we'd like to get better. We'd like to have a better relationship, but to do that from a position of strength. I think it couldn't have been set up better. I'm not surprised that we're not walking away with anything dramatic out of this meeting, but it does a lot to stabilize a relationship from a position of strength and getting the two sides to talk about resolving problems. Until now, it's been very one-sided with the Russians pushing and the U.S. really not pushing back.
You know, far from a reset, even Mr. Putin today saying that, you know, things had deteriorated between the U.S. under Donald Trump. A lot of people have voiced the same thing. I mean, has Rex Tillerson's job in this last 24 hours been partly to at least explain what the U.S. policy is? Because one of the complaints we heard from Sergei Lavrov, the Russians don't know.
Well, I think you can't listen to what the Russians say because they're always trying to flip the issue for their own advantage. So take, for instance, where we started here. At the end of the Obama administration, relations with Russia were terrible. To say now that they have gotten worse, well, why have they gotten worse? It's because of Russian actions since Trump became president. Trump was signaling, I'd like to get along. What does Russia do? It supports Assad that uses chemical weapons. It flares up the violence in Ukraine again. It buzzes U.S. warships in the Baltic Sea. This is naturally not going to lead to an improvement in the relationship. And I think Tillerson's job is actually to say, no, we're not going to be intimidated by this. We do have issues that we care about. We're going to stand on them. And we'd like to work with you if you can. So what are you prepared to do? And to flip it back onto Russia.
Yeah, and naturally, Russia's not going to be excited to hear President Trump reaffirming America's commitment to NATO. Trump would say this is him being flexible. Others might say it's flip-flopping when he's now saying NATO is no longer obsolete, although he said the complete opposite in the past. But what do you think of those comments? And do you trust that President Trump will stay committed to NATO?
Well, I do, and I think we've seen several members of the cabinet prior to this articulate a fairly clear position on NATO. Vice President Pence at the Munich Security Conference, Rex Tillerson at the G20 meeting in Germany, Secretary of Defense Mattis and Secretary of State Tillerson at NATO foreign ministers' meetings. The message has been very clear. Strong U.S. support for NATO, following through on the deployments in the Baltic states and Poland, demand that allies spend their 2% of GDP on defense as they have already committed to do, and a desire that NATO take on modern threats and challenges like terrorism. Very, very consistent. Consistent, in fact, with prior administrations as well. This is not new stuff, but with a lot more emphasis coming from the Trump administration. And that is actually, as Stoltenberg said in the press conference today, already produced some results from allies, too.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's great to have you because you're a former U.S. ambassador to NATO. So it just struck me as odd. It's been widely reported that Mr. Tillerson actually said to foreign ministers at the G7, why should U.S. taxpayers be interested in Ukraine? Why would he say that? Surely it matters to the U.S. Surely it matters to U.S. allies. And it matters to Baltic states for sure.
Sure. I clearly believe that it matters quite a lot. I think it was a rhetorical question because if he's constantly being asked by allies, how will the U.S. do more? Will the U.S. follow through? He wants them to think through the domestic challenge of explaining to American taxpayers, why should we spend money on Europe's defense if Europe is not willing to spend its own money on Europe's defense? Why should we
But it's strategically important to the U.S., is it not?
Of course it is. Yeah. No, I agree. And I think Tillerson knows that. I think everybody knows that. I think he's using that rhetorical question to get allied foreign ministers to think through what their position, when expressed in the U.S., what it really means, in order to get them to do more so that we actually rise the tide, float the alliance higher, rather than threaten to tear it down.
I mean, it was an offhanded remark by Tillerson. I mean, do you think that it signals that perhaps the U.S. might ease sanctions on Russia over Ukraine?
No, I don't think so. Again, you know, he was the one at the G20 meeting to first come out and say the U.S. is not going to do that.
Right.
The sanctions that are in place because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine are still there because Russia has not changed its actions. And we've seen Lindsey Graham, for example, in the Senate saying if the administration were to move to lift them, the Senate would reapply them anyway and impose the same conditions. And so as a result of that, I don't think you're going to see the administration rushing to do this. Add on top of that Russia's behavior over the past several weeks, it hasn't created a climate that would lead the U.S. to want to lift those sanctions.
You know, we heard Donald Trump using the word butcher today when he was talking about Bashar al-Assad. A lot of people wouldn't disagree with that. Do you think that there's a risk for the Trump administration that, I don't know, the more you highlight and criticize Assad's brutality, the more that there is an expectation that the next time he does something, you've got to do something about it, and then where does that lead?
Well, I think that's right, and I think it is good to create that expectation. He obviously felt 10 days ago or a week ago that he had a green light. He felt that Russia and Iran had his back. The U.S. was focused only on ISIS, so why not go ahead and use a chemical weapons attack on your opponents? I think he's now seen that there's a cost to doing that. And what I think Tillerson is trying to do, and others as well trying to do by raising the rhetoric, is to make clear to Assad that there are, in fact, very strong limits that we do care about. There will be action in an effort to deter him from doing it. It's not that we want to be more deeply involved in Syria. What we want is to prevent those kinds of chemical weapon attacks or other massive assaults on the Syrian population.
Yeah, but what remains unclear is what the U.S.'s way forward is on Syria and what the U.S. and Russia's way forward, possibly together,
A very
is
big
on
topic.
Syria.
Yeah.
Exactly. Ambassador Kurt Volker, appreciate your perspective. Thanks for your time.
Good discussion.
Thank you.